Good afternoon. As chairman of the Associated Student Speakers Program, I'd like to welcome you to our second program of the winter quarter. We're very lucky to have with us Mr. Lawrence Durrell, who's out here for Arthur Miller's 80th birthday. Henry.
Sorry.
Okay. Mr. Durrell is the author of some famous books, the Alexandrian Quartet, and he's going to give a few introductory remarks, after which we're going to go into a question and answer period. We have roving mics, so if you raise your hand, we'll bring a mic to you. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Mr. Lawrence Durrell.
Ladies and gentlemen, as I was saying to Arthur Miller only this morning, I have said before, but I'd like to say again, how grateful I was for this invitation, and
I can't hear you.
Is it okay? How grateful I was for this invitation, because I was rather alarmed at the state of Henry Miller's health. He'd just been through two rather savage, dangerous operations, and this was a wonderful opportunity to come and check up on him and see what was going forward. Also, it was a fine opportunity to renew my expressions of affection and admiration for this great American sage. I sent him a telegram saying, "Salute of 81 guns, O sage." He didn't like that very much. He doesn't want to be a sage at all. Anyway, the relief was enormous because on arrival here I found that he was at least 10 years younger than when I left him year before last, and it's clear that he thrives on operations and should have 2 serious ones every year. And last night he renewed ping pong for an hour and a half and played a very savage game with 3 people, so that I feel tremendously elated. I'd like to describe to you briefly, fairly briefly, the set of perfectly fortuitous circumstances under which I made his acquaintance. I wanted to be a writer. When I was 23, 24, I got married to a young and beautiful painter, and I decided that I myself was going to write poetry, but I did what was really an extremely dangerous thing. Instead of sitting around in London cultivating people, I went and buried myself in a Greek island, where I lived more or less like a fisherman. It was a blissful period, but from a point of view of a career, it would have been practically fatal, I should say, for anyone. And yet, by some mysterious chain of circumstances, within 2 years, I had acquired 3 literary uncles. Still, when I think back on it, I can't really quite get over the good luck. First of all, my publisher turned out to be T.S. Eliot, and a young poet of 24 is tremendously lucky to have a publisher who himself is a famous poet and who can help and guide him. And Eliot was a perfectly delightful, quiet, sage uncle to whom I owe really much more than I can say. He shaped my various books of poems, and I found it with the greatest difficulty to get a bad poem past him. And he was a man so conscientious that he would sit up all night to write to you to prove why a line was weak or strong. And it was marvelous to have him in the cockpit at Faber and Faber in London, and to know that my wretched manuscripts were receiving at least an expert eye to look them over. My second uncle at that moment was George Seferis, the Greek poet who just died recently after winning the Nobel Prize. And he was part of my social life. He'd been a consul in Albania, which was quite near the island of Corfu, and I met him in Athens, and with him I was able to talk. He spoke excellent English and French and was widely cultivated, as everyone brought up at Oxford and the Sorbonne would be. He didn't know Eliot, but he was already translating The Wasteland, so it made a sort of common platform for our conversations and talks. And it's thanks to him, and largely through his eyes, that I first began to see the outlines of the Greece I came to like so much. The third uncle I discovered in a public lavatory in Corfu. Some passing American had left a copy of Tropic of Cancer there. And this book shook me from stem to stern. It's practically impossible to describe to you how outrageous and how adventurous it seemed to us then, because there was practically nothing to compare it with. I'm thinking of four-letter words, permissiveness, pornography, what have you. Now we have some real filth against which we can compare Miller, and relatively speaking, he's rather mild and rather Leaves of Grass. But in those days, it was the most outrageous of all the books available. Even Lady Chatterley didn't go as far as that. And yet it was raging with health. It hurt like toothache, and it bussed about like Rabelais. And I gave it an instant certificate for genius. And I wrote the perennial fan letter on the back of a postcard: "Dear Sir, I adore you. Thank you. Goodbye." The sort of thing we occasionally get ourselves nowadays. To my intense surprise, I didn't expect it, but I got an answer, a curious answer. It was some time before I discovered that what he liked was the stamp on the letter. He's a sucker for stamps. If ever you want a letter from him, send him a letter, a fan letter, with a curious stamp on it, either of India or Mexico or something, and you'll surely get an answer. It was the Greek stamps, which were particularly beautiful in those days, so I sent him a lot of these stamps. And then for about 2 years we corresponded before we met. And then we met in Paris, and Bob Snyder's film gives a pretty fair account of that matter. I say fortuitous, but I was thinking of the friendships of other writers, perhaps more celebrated, and perhaps one shouldn't mention them in the same breath, but it seems that every writer needs a kind of placental relationship with another writer to approve of him and to help him, to reassure him. And it seems very curious how they come up in doubles, and such very dissimilar people. I am very frequently asked, how could a writer like you admire Miller, and what on earth could he see in you? The second question is difficult, I know. But a friendship is not qualified by the actual material one produces. And in our case, what we had in common was an unprofessional attitude to literature. In other words, neither of us were really interested in literature, nor was Anais Nin. We were interested in other things. That is to say, we were not professional littérateurs, and we didn't think professionally about writing. Writing for us was a kind of windscreen wiper, which might help us to look ourselves in the eye a little more clearly, to liberate ourselves or to realize ourselves. In other words, our preoccupation was not literary but philosophic, really. But when you think, for example, of friendships like Nietzsche and Wagner, Wordsworth and Coleridge, things seem to go in doubles, and I wonder if there isn't a kind of biological law which pairs writers like it pairs the sexes. It seems a strange thing, but they do tend to come up in couples. And Mother Nature is always at work, because any comedian will tell you that it's a matter of luck whether Laurel finds Hardy or Hardy finds Laurel. In fact, they didn't find each other, and they were consequently completely unknown until their late 40s. These things I regard as destiny and as perfectly fortuitous. For the rest, I got to Paris after a year, and I met Miller, and I learned very many lessons from him, not about writing, but about simple things. For example, the joy of ordinary living, which I somehow felt as an English poet wasn't necessary. Also the pleasure in simple acts, such as cleaning a table or washing up, which I also felt as a poet I should never have to learn. I watched him. He was my first genius. I watched him with closest attention and with devotion, which enabled me to be of real service to him. And it makes me extremely proud to recall that I was able to find books for him that he needed. Nijinsky, Alan Watts owes me a debt. I found Alan Watts for him in London. I found many books on Buddhism. And it is a wonderful feeling to think that had I not pushed prodded, tortured, and kicked Mr. Miller to coming to Greece, we should never have had the Colossus of Marusi. So that's a feather in my cap. Finally, then, the husband of Anais Nin had a nice flat in Notting Hill Gate in London, and he invited myself and my wife to go and stay there. And it was here that I brought Eliot together with Miller, and it was here also that Miller met Dylan Thomas. So in a way, I've been quite a decent press attaché for Miller. And of course, my rewards were in heaven, because I can't read the Colossus without remembering that fascinating period. It was a risky thing to do in a way, because Miller was a townsman. He had never liked the country before, and Greece was the first time that he ever appreciated country life and country living. And I think that the Greek experience was probably one of his greatest pleasures. Certainly the joy rings all the way through that book. Then, of course, the war came, and he was sent back by the British consul, and we were separated, and I started my long and dreary pilgrimage through the Middle East, through the purlieus of minor diplomacy, and through the boredom of that tedious war, which I hope they won't repeat during my lifetime. After the war, we met together again, but it was a number of years. I was rather far away. He visited Europe, but he went to Spain with Deltay and couldn't come to see me in Cyprus. Then at last we had a really splendid reunion twice in Provence. He came with his children and stayed for 2 whole summers. And here we reworked the entire thread. And I was relieved to find that in spite of all our differences of opinion on literary matters, we criticized each other quite woundingly and quite openly, but our essential friendship and our essential devotion to each other was never troubled in the slightest. In fact, it was rather fun to get irritated with each other from time to time, and we've remained astonishingly and consistently friendly to each other. Anais Nin, Miller, Joe Perles, myself, and the Colossus of Marusi. I don't know of any other group of literary people who have stayed so consistently on good terms with each other, meanwhile disagreeing frequently. But we disagree in the manner of engineers discussing different kinds of spacecraft. One has a preference for this, one for that. And the disagreements that we do have, I sometimes have disagreements with Anais, who ticks me off, never in any way prejudice our very close, warm friendship. Now, Miller, as you know, is 80, and he started off by being terrified out of his wits at the idea of celebrations. He said he wouldn't go to any, but he's been to nearly all. I was just explaining to your president here that if he tends to wriggle, it's not from lack of sociability, but he really has had a very bad hip operation, and this hip is agony. And he foresees even the vista of walking to the library and then to the reception during his last appearance was a real effort for him. And once that hip gets a hold of him, it means bed for 3 or 4 days and no ping pong, and it makes him miserable. So if he tends to be shy, it's partly the terror of having to walk 100 yards, which really represents something serious for him at his age. Though from a ping pong point of view, he can stand perfectly still and play a marvelous game. Now, he made me promise today not to do formalized things, and I personally am breaking my own rule in coming here at all. I'm committing intellectual harakiri, because when I first discovered I could make a living by writing and not by teaching, I decided never to lecture again in public. And this is the first exception for 15 years. That said, I think my time is nearly shot, and I'm under his instructions. I'm going to ask you if there are perhaps any questions. He has a theory, and I think it's probably right. He said lectures are the most frustrating things. You always go with 3 or 4 questions in your head, then the lecturer overshoots his time, and there's never time to ask them. So in order to prevent that happening, I hereby declare this open for questions.
No questions.
Oh, that's all right then. So,
Which novels or authors would you say have been most influential in influencing your type of writing?
My writing or Miller's?
Yours.
Do you mean novels as such? I'm afraid of a fairly orthodox pattern, nothing terribly interesting, from Dickens through Kipling, Conrad. And in the modern novel, I mean, people like Saul Bellow and John Fowles. It's really nothing very esoteric. I mean, but I'm fundamentally not a novelist at all, really. I don't know quite what I am, but my novels are kind of one-dimensional shadow plays. Do you know what I mean? They're not.
Yes.
They're not depth studies of individual psychologies. And so I wonder whether I dare call myself a novelist.
Well, I was interested in how you developed your style of writing. It's very different from most other authors, and I was interested how you were able to.
It developed out of French, out of copying French sources largely. Jules Laforgue, his Moralité légendaire, which influenced very much Joyce also, and there are other novels which perhaps are not novels. Do you know E.E. Cummings' Enormous Room?
Yes.
Well, technically, that's a great feat of arms, and I learnt and read that book repeatedly. I learned a great deal from it. And there's another thing that struck me, particularly about Miller, and which I forgot to ask him about, and which I must. I think that the style of Tropic of Cancer was probably taken from Gauguin's memoirs, Noah Noah, because I noticed there's a quote from Gauguin in the middle of it somewhere, the catalogue that Strindberg wrote for his painting. I must remember to ask him about that.
I'd like to know if I could get a Papa poet too. I've got 140 poems. I'd like to know why one has to expatriate from his own country. My father's a Canadian, so that's where I'm going. I'd like to know why I've been spat upon. I'd like to get some help so I can get off the streets. I've appreciated your writing. You'll appreciate my poetry. My name is Kenneth McAlpin.
How do you do?
How do you do? I do honestly.
Listen,
about the insensitive people,
well,
the intellectual fascists on either side of me. I'd like to have some help so I can get off the streets.
When you say help, do you need a publisher or do you need money?
Yes, I need a publisher. I need some money so I can have meal for my French
Look
Canadian
here, there
friends.
never was a time, surely, when there were more published. I don't know anybody unpublished, even bad today.
Well, I'm very good, actually, but I'd like to have some technical help, and I'd like to get a Papa poet. A man, in other words, among a bunch of little boys at UCLA. Okay?
But are you at the university here?
No. I graduated and I can't be here at night for political reasons, but it's still the day.
It does surprise me. I never knew a period where publishers were more ready to read.
Very good. I'll be in recording pretty soon because I also sing very well, but I'd like to publish the thing.
We all have our difficulties, but we have to try it on the dog, you know.
Oh, well, I know. Well, I'd like to talk with you later. The name is McAlpin, 66 UCLA in Intellectual Oblivion. It was called Anthropology. Okay.
Mr. Durrell, a question, please. Mr. Durrell.
Sir. Over there. Oh, sorry.
I have a question. You've had some very interesting experiences, particularly as the quartet would show, and a few other pieces, as Mr. Miller does. I would like to have your ideas, your conception, wherein the author transforms the experience through the mind, onto the paper, into the novel, or whatever. Some ideas, some conceptions in this particular, almost philosophical.
Well, to oversimplify terribly, so as not to take up too much of your time, I wanted to write something that was very contemporary, and I asked myself what on earth a contemporary work would be like if it had to deal with our contemporary preoccupations. What was our particular myth? And I came to the conclusion that the inside world had dispersed the ego through psychoanalysis, through Freud, and the philosophic and anthropological preoccupations. Our old stable Victorian ego, which seemed to present a perfectly rounded shape, had got broken down into a series of voices, so to speak. You see, a fantasy world and the unconscious and all that. It had dispersed the stability of the ego. Now, in terms of the outside world, the Einsteinian relativity process had disturbed and finally broken down the old notion, Victorian notion of matter as something solid, because fundamentally they believed that if you broke atom after atom and got right down to the bottom, there would be some indestructible little heart to it, rather like a dice, but which would be solid. Well, when they did manage to break it, it turned into a wave. Then finally it turned into something that could hardly be photographed, but had to be divined. And there again, the stability of our worldview got broken down and dispersed and shattered. Now, if that was reality for us, what would ordinary life looked at seen through this magic lantern? What would ordinary life, which in the old novel had a stable ego where the guy was born, went to school, married and died, A, B, C, D, Z, or was perhaps this search for non-linear forms in its own way a kind of expression of what had happened to the psyche through Freud and through the world through Einstein? I came to the conclusion that it was probably that. And in the quartet I tried to do a little shadow play, a sort of optical play, which put a question mark over for example, the human personality. Is it real or is it an illusion? I mean by that the individual personality. Consequently, by switching the thing about, I created distrust of the solid linear proportions and gave an illusion of, gave an illusionist, a conjurer's view of a so-called stable state. Those are roughly the contentions. It's oversimplified, and I'd probably have to develop them a little way further to make them completely comprehensible in a formal way. But roughly speaking, it was a breakdown of the inner and the outer worlds that I wanted to picture, and at the same time I wanted to write something as readable as Rider Haggard. Why not?
Can I go? Okay. You mentioned myth before, and then in your talk you were talking about Alan Watts' book, and there's a great deal of myth in the quartet.
Could you hold up your hand?
Oh,
I see.
over here.
Yes.
There's a great deal of myth in the quartet, what you at First Wharton call the mythopoeic universe. And I think also that Darley, the narrator's, the pattern of his experience is similar to the kind of archetypal hero's experience in Joseph Campbell's description. Was a lot of this intentional? I'm sure some of it was. Were there any books that you had in mind to base the pattern of the novels, or was it just a reflection of what you had read, like Alan Watts?
Well, a very great deal of it was. But in the case of Alexandria, on the historical side, I took that as the point of focus for our entire culture. You see, it was there that the various traditions, Christian, Gnostic, Judaism, and so on, it was the point of impact, so to speak, where Tibet came and knocked Carthage. And out of that came the rest of our culture in slow progression. I wanted to emphasize a little bit that historical side of it, but I was terribly influenced I did a little bit of intellectual slumming while I was there, and I got very stuck on the Gnostics. The resistance movement to ordinary Christianity, which seemed to me now, at this remove, to have quite a large Zen product buried in their attitude to life. And variously speaking, all over the Middle East, there are the orthodox resisting people like the Hasidim, etc., who philosophically, I suppose, are the last remnants of paganism. I wanted to get that in, if I could, as a flavor, because it's so true to Alexandria. And that resistance movement, of course, followed its way up right into France through the Bogomils, and you had the Albigensis troubles in France, you see, and I suspect it's the same sort of pagan movement which is troubling Ireland at this moment. Protestant, Cathar, Bogomil, and Catholic Orthodox. I don't know how true that is, but vaguely that was what I had in mind.
I'd like to ask you some questions about your brother, Gerald.
That man? Yes.
Yes. Do you take credit for having gotten him into the literary world, or?
No, absolutely not. He's a born writer. Alas.
Yes, well, he said...
No, you know, he's a scandal, that boy. First of all, he doesn't like writing at all. He only writes in order... Do you know what he does? He makes a lot of money, spends it on animals. Can you beat it?
Yes, I know.
Instead of spending it on hash or something practical, he spends it on animals. He's got a very nice zoo. I saw him a month ago. He came to stay with me. He's got a very nice zoo, small but beautifully professional, in Jersey. And they're just making that film of his this year, My Family and Other Animals.
Yes, I'd like to see
I don't know
that.
who's going to play me. I believe one of his gorillas.
Did you ever have a brother, Leslie? That
Yes. He hasn't gone to prison. It's not what you think.
Because in Bitter Lemons you referred to your brother who was dead, and obviously
Yes, we
you're
kill
referring
each
to
other
Gerald.
off, you know. He does dirty tricks to me, as you see, and I
Yes.
killed him off once in Bitter Lemons. And then there are some hidden slights in the quartet, which only he could possibly understand, which are deeply wounding.
You
But
fiend.
now he pretends he hasn't read the quartet, you see. So you can't win.
Did Miller and Anais share your respect for George Groddeck?
For?
Groddeck? In the Book of the Id?
I think Anais did, but I don't know. I don't know whether Henry's even read it. My Groddeck experience came during the period when I was out of contact with him. Of that, I'm more proud than I am of my own work, because I found the last copy of Groddeck, and I found the English translation had gone long out of print. I found it in Jerusalem in the middle of the war, and I started trying to mobilize help from publishers. And just 3 months before Madame Groddeck's death, we found that she had one copy left of that, and it's now, fortunately, reprinted in 5 languages. It's, of course, one of my favorite books, and at Christmas I always give away 5 or 6 as Christmas presents. Do you like it yourself? Yes, it's a marvelous book. And you'll be pleased to know that they're doing his complete works now in 6 volumes, because there's some interesting studies in etymology, literature, philosophy, and those volumes will fit pretty snugly in between Freud and Jung, because it's the point de départ for psychosome, really. He's the grandpa of psychosomatic. Brill got all the credit because he was systematic, and Groddeck was always fooling about. But in fact, he was the grandfather. And of course, the first man to use massage, because you see, the awful thing about psychoanalysis is you're mostly facing somebody across the table, and ideas and thoughts and questions and answers tend to become part of the conscious apparatus. But a chap who says, take your clothes off, I'm going to give you a massage, and psychoanalyzes you while you're groaning, that's a different matter.
Mr. Durrell, I wrote a paper in a English class one time comparing you with Bernard Malamud, and during the course of writing the paper I became very interested in the subject of relativity, and later on in the subject of esoteric philosophy.
Yes.
And lately I've noticed a lot of bookstores and publishing houses which are coming out with esoteric works in the United States, especially in the large cities like New York and Los Angeles. What do you think of the influx of esoteric thought, especially the thought having to do with I suppose you might call it contemplation or meditation or Sufism or Gnosticism, the various esoteric schools on American thinking or Western thinking in general?
I should suppose it to be absolutely inevitable in an extremely materialistic age and in a materialistic Protestant culture that one would, for sheer relief, turn to something which philosophically was more reposing, and certainly which contained a worldview which wasn't egoistic. Because you see, the substance of our materialist philosophy is the vaunting of the ego, which is the absolute opposite of what these other religions and philosophies attempt to preach. Also, we notice now with alarm that our way of going, the road we are taking, is severing us from contact with the universe and from our fellow man and from our position, either from the point of view of society or from the point of view of the world in which we live. Whereas these other religions at least pretend to offer one an integration, a cosmic integration, if you like, which on the ordinary level should pay off in better better human relations, and perhaps in better relations between societies. I should say that it's probably with a bit of panic that we are going that way. Nevertheless, it's also very recent when you think that the first translations of the Chinese philosophers are only about 40 years old. Alan Watts, of course, had the privilege, I think, of being brought up. I think his mother was a Chinese bonzesse or something. At any rate, at the age of 21, he wrote a very good book, which remains to this day an excellent one, on Zen Buddhism, which Miller particularly enjoyed. I'm personally very, very sympathetic to that sort of view. But then I was born in India, and I spent until the age of 12 there. Though I haven't really any denominational religion, I should think of myself really as a sort of religious man in the anthropological sense.
Socrates said that the last person that anyone should talk to about a work of art is the artist. Would you care to comment?
Yes, I suppose in a sense, I think I see what he meant. You can ask him about the intentions of the work, but the results of the work, I think, belong to you. It's once the work is done, it's really detached. It's no longer your own property. And I think most artists who feel that the job is well done get frightfully bored at having to go on discussing it. You want to get on with something new. It's always the next book and the next thing that's interesting you. On the other hand, too, there's an interesting point in that, because it points up what I was trying to say about Miller, Nin, and myself, etc., that we never were professionally interested in literature. We always regarded it as either a form of Socratic inquiry or a philosophic anxiety, but it was our lives that interested us, and the literature was a sort of catalyst to windscreen wipe, to help, to prod, to inject. But we were not interested in literature as a career. No?
There seemed to be another author that might be thrown in that terribly parallels your development also, Mr. Miller. Probably lives in the same area. Mr. Graves.
Robert Graves?
Yes. What has been the interaction between yourself and Mr. Graves?
I've never met Mr. Graves, and I admire him very much, both as a poet, and I think The White Goddess is a great book. He lives in the island of Majorca, and we have many common friends. And naturally, all those big writers from the First World War, Richard Aldington, Robert Graves, Wilfred Owen, he's of that generation, you know. But naturally, when we were young men of 20, 19, 18, they influenced us very, very deeply. I haven't met him personally, but I think White Goddess is a great anthropological work, and the poems put him right into the top class.
Would you consider the inspiration of Colossus of Marusi particular in time and place, or is inspiration where you find it?
Inspiration for Miller?
Yes.
He's a real man, you know. The Colossus. You didn't think he was a fiction, did you? The Colossus, you didn't think he was a fiction. He's a real chap.
Well, no, I just knew it as the story. I didn't know
Oh,
the
well,
background.
I mean, his name is Mr. George Katsimbalis, and he lives in Athens. And he looks rather like Rému, if you've ever seen French films. And he's still in roaring voice. I saw him last summer. But Miller's account of him is really a reportage based on reality. It's not invented at all. He talks just like that. It's terrifying. And once they got together, they had a sort of mutual hypnotic effect on each other. They went off, traveled all over Greece, talking day and night. They used to talk till they fell asleep. It's very bad for the health.
Mr. Durrell, is there any Indian writer you admire? This is out of sheer curiosity, I'm asking.
Modern Indian writer?
Yes.
I'm not terribly well up in Indian writing at the moment. I have a writer I do admire very much, Mulkraj Anand.
Yes.
Who's by way also being a friend, but he wouldn't be one of the younger ones now. He'd be about my age, wouldn't he?
Yes.
I'm afraid I'm not tremendously abreast of Indian
Do
writing.
you have any opinion of Dom Marias as a poet?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Dom Marias.
Yes, but he's not an Indian writer.
He's Indian, but...
I know he's Indian, but he's writing British books.
Right. What do you think of him?
What?
What do you think of
Well, I think it's marvelous journalism. He's a good poet too, but he's much more like an English boy than an Indian.
Right, he calls himself the brown Englishman.
Yes,
Right.
yes. But I mean, I should say he'd fit in perfectly easily if he were not an Indian with the average British culture.
Right.
He's a very good writer, like John Wayne, for example. But I have difficulty in thinking of him as characteristically Indian.
Right.
Do you see? And there's that marvelous writer Naipaul, you see.
Yes, I think
Well,
so.
it's a very fascinating problem you have there, because you've got people caught between two cultures. Now, his criticism of India's lack of interest in lavatories is a perfectly British Protestant one.
Right.
And that's why he had an enormous success with the British for criticizing the lavatory system. But you see, this is absolutely a misunderstanding
But he's not
on a very
Indian
large
either.
scale. What?
Yeah, he's not Indian either because he's lived in Trinidad.
He's in Trinidad,
Yeah.
isn't he? But is he not Indian?
Well, he's lived all his life in Trinidad, and he went back to India, and then
Yes,
he wrote
well,
An
that
Area of
marvelous
Darkness.
book. It was a marvelous book, but it was very curious to analyze the values of it, because his criticisms were perfectly Britannic. Marvelous book, and what a writer. It's adorable.
Mr. Durrell, have you read any of Malcolm Lowry, and do you like him?
Yes, I like him very much. He's great. I think the Under the Volcano is excellent. There's one thing, one qualification I have with him. He seems to blow up. His sense of form seems defective. I think it's because he was drinking so heavily. Do you know? He killed himself literally with 8 bottles of scotch, you know. His father was a miller. I never met him myself, but the books are great. They really are great. Only there's some defect in the sense of form. I mean to say that there's never a payoff punch at the end. It kind of evaporates away the book. Do you feel that? You feel the wholeness of the book that way. You're thinking of the volcano, are you?
Have you read any of the criticism of Under the Volcano in terms of the Kabbalah?
No, I haven't. Is that the one that interests you most? Yes. No, I haven't read it. No, he's a great writer.
What do you think of the over here, to your right? What do you think of the charges of the feminist Kate Millett against Henry Miller?
Charges of the
Feminist Kate Millett. She wrote a book called Sexual Politics, in which she goes into the female characters of Norman Mailer and Henry Miller and D.H. Lawrence.
I haven't read it. I read about it. It's difficult without seeing the charges to be able to know what they are. But Henry's always being accused because he's a bit brutal. He's over brutal, rather like a psychoanalyst will shake up a recalcitrant patient. He perhaps works them too hard. But in fact, his intentions are quite different. Do you know? As he always says rather plaintively when he gets a kick in the pants from woman's lib or something, he says, I wish they'd understand that my real intention is self-liberation and not sex, and sex happens to be the weak point of departure where I can insert the tin opener into our culture, but my intentions are vastly different. They are, as I say, self-liberation and not anything else. At least that's his excuse, and he stands by it.
I was hoping somebody else would ask the question, but since they haven't, I'll have to go ahead. Unlike the Miller's Colossus, your character of Pursewarden, you said was fictional. Could you comment on his development? Was he expressing some of your alter ego type ideas, or comment on his character?
I think so, yes. Yes, he was. He's my favorite character of fiction. Yes. I felt very intensely that I could use the split, the dichotomy which exists in all of us, and make my hero two-sided. Mr. Darley, you see, who couldn't find a way of achieving his apotheosis as a writer, and Mr. Pursewarden, who had achieved his, and who obstinately refused to move from that position until the seat was warm for Darley. I mean, it's pretty vague, but the general suggestion was that we are not individuals but part of a tradition, and that we hand on. Each one has a tremendous struggle to find himself, and then he finds himself, and he suddenly finds everybody with it. And in the course of his practice, he creates a tradition which somebody else can grab hold of to form themselves. The role between those two writers was roughly meant to be that. So that at the end, when Pursewarden dies, Darley suddenly gets the kick in the pants that is necessary to be.
Mr. Durrell, I read that Henry Miller disliked your character Pursewarden a little bit.
He disliked most of my characters, yes. Yes.
What was his exact criticism of the character Pursewarden?
He doesn't like snide limeys. It's quite legitimate, why should he?
I have a purely speculative sort of question. I know in reading your books, fiction as well as nonfiction, Reflections in a Marine Venus, in your books and another novelist, Anthony Burgess, there's a real sort of love of words. Prose is not something merely utilitarian, but there's a sort of infatuation with words, all sorts of words, not only English, but other languages. Is there any reason for this? Is there some sort of syndrome among British writers?
Well, no, but we've got this fantastically marvelous instrument, which is a mixture of ragbag and accordion. You see, it's far less rigid than any of the other languages to work in. I can't pronounce on Russian or German, but certainly than French or Spanish. And you've got such a terribly rich instrument. Why not a few arpeggios? I mean, why not throw it about? I think literature should be a bit of a jam session. We've time for one more question, I'm afraid.
What sort of control did you have when your book Justine was made into a movie? Did you know?
I had none, no. I was forced to sell the rights of the quartet because they came at a moment when nobody else had any bids in the wind and I was broke. It enabled me to buy my cottage, so I don't regret the matter. I haven't seen Justine, and there's no special reason, except that it was playing in Paris when I'd left for the States. It was playing in the States when I came to Chicago, and I've been consistently hedge-hopping behind it ever since. I will see it. I know that opinions are terribly divided. My friends think it's hell. My enemies say hurrah.
Yeah, I was disappointed in the movie myself. I enjoyed your quartet, though.
Did you really?
Yes, I did.
Oh, good. Well, that gives me courage. I shall certainly see it, but I haven't caught up with it. I was looking at the paper today, wondering if it was on in Los Angeles, but it isn't. It'll come on Saturday when I leave. That's all, I'm afraid. Thank you for listening.